Good afternoon and welcome. I'm going to switch to gallery view just so that people get an opportunity to stare at my handsome face as much as yours, Tim. Very nice to see you once again, my old compadre from the radio years. Tim Hardford, ladies and gentlemen, author of numerous books on economics and related topics, and now a new series of your Cautionary Tales podcast. Good afternoon. How are you?
I'm a little warm, but I'm doing very well, thank you, Simon.
It's extraordinary to think, isn't it, that during the summer, my wife, at any rate, I don't know about yours, tries to encourage me to deliberately visit places that are as hot as this in what is known as a holiday. I can barely even function at home in this heat. It's horrendous.
I dimly remember the concept of holidays, yes. But yeah, it is extraordinary. Well, I guess the whole point is it encourages you to stop working, so maybe that's...
Maybe that's what it is. It is actually true that she has a much more fierce work ethic than mine, so perhaps she needs an oppressive heat in order to slow her down, whereas I find that I'm quite capable of just easing off. We were supposed to be in Sicily this week. It's still in my diary, unfortunately, still penned in. And I mean, I don't know whether it's pro rata down there, but it's usually a good 5, if not 10 degrees warmer in Sicily than it is here. I mean, I would just be a puddle by now. Horrendous.
I can imagine it would be warm there. The way that the former diary entries torment us, it's quite a thing, isn't it?
Yeah. I've actually folded up the desk diary. That's just on a shelf now. I can't bear to look at that. The 2020. Do you have one of those?
A desk diary for 2020? No, I mean for 1996, yes.
No, is that as far back as you stopped using paper? I got it out because I hoped it might be a little bit more, it might sort of action me a little bit more, seeing things actually written in ink might sort of make them seem a little bit more like I committed to them mentally rather than them just appearing as pixels. I don't know, it's very impersonal, isn't it? When you've actually made an imprint on a page.
I'm all in favour of pen and paper when the time is right. I did go through a phase of having those insufferably cool moleskin diaries, but I've been on Google Calendar for about 5 years now.
I think it's Michael Bywater wrote a great piece criticising people's use of the Moleskine brand because he said it was a... I'm getting terrible. I might just take this out. I don't know if it's me. I'm getting my own... can you still hear me?
I can still hear you, yeah.
Yeah, that's good. I don't know if it's my microphone that's causing it glitchy. Michael Bywater said that the Moleskine brand had been responsible for more artist blocks or more kind of anxiety and self-consciousness than any other brand of stationery, that people buy these things thinking, oh, this is what Hemingway used and Bruce Chatwin and Picasso and God knows who else as they jet off to some European capital and sit there desperately trying to think of something that will live up to that kind of heritage. I think you're much better off with a W.H. Smith A4.
Yes, quadrille. That's what you want. The ones with the little tiny squares.
The squares, yeah. That's the
mathematician.
Really
good for all kinds of nerdiness.
Yeah,
absolutely. It's actually the Dungeons and Dragons nerd in me, but.
So you've completed some new cautionary tales, which is a great format, which is a sort of social science and quirky history and a little bit of what we can learn, which is always nice to know what you should take away from stories. The one that caught my eye when you did the last series was the Keith Jarrett one about the Cone concert. The Cologne concert.
That's pretty much the only one with a happy ending, depending on how you. Sometimes it's a matter of opinion what's a happy ending, but yes, most of the cautionary tales.
Yeah, it was cautionary in the sense of we caution you against
sinking, blowing up, crashing.
Yeah. But this one cautioned you against pulling out and declining because equipment isn't up to scratch. Sometimes that sort of thing can actually lead to creative fire. Absolutely.
So the really mundane version of this is the time there was a tube strike and they were able to track people moving around the London Underground system and realised that at the end of the tube strike, which is only 48 hours, at the end of the tube strike, tens of thousands of commuters had figured out a better way to get to work, and they never went back. So that's your kind of totally everyday version of it. But the Keith Jarrett story is, I mean, it's worth looking up in full, but in a nutshell, it was booked to play this huge concert in Cologne by a very ambitious 17-year-old kid called Vera Branders. There was a screw up on the piano. The piano he got was too quiet, out of tune, all beaten up, didn't sound good at all. He was guilt-tripped into playing because he didn't want to let this 17-year-old girl to face 1,400 angry jazz fans whom she couldn't give a refund. So he played, and it turned out to be, well, he would not say it was the performance of his life, but everybody else thinks it was the performance of his life. Certainly the most popular piece of music he ever played.
It was extraordinary. I've got that album.
Just that he overcame the obstacle, yeah.
I've got that album, and it was quite an early one that I bought when I started getting into jazz, because it is a legendary album. And I then found other albums that he's also recorded in the same mode, which is essentially that he sits down to play at the piano with no idea at all. He tries to sleep the night before with like complete oblivion in his mind, having no kind of anticipated, chord structure or anything. And he literally improvises like for an hour with just like seeking out a chord sequence and variations and improvisations off the top of it. And it's an incredibly moving piece of music. It's quite sort of deep and soulful. It almost has a sort of Aaron Copland meets Southern spiritual kind of vibe to it, rather than pure jazz. But what I couldn't work out was, I can't find an earlier example of that mode in which he operates. He's done later ones. There's a Vienna concert. There's one at La Scala, which I think is in Milan. And they've sold well, but they're all regarded as being sequels, essentially, to the Cologne concert, which means that he sat down and did that with that bad piano, without any kind of precedent of even knowing he was capable of doing it at all, which is extraordinary.
It is. I mean, he had been giving concerts in that mode, but not for very long, and never in front of such a big audience. And actually, ECM Records, he had a record contract with somebody else.
Right.
And ECM cannily signed the contract to do this particular kind of thing with Keith Jarrett, like the made up live concert performances, because the other record label wasn't interested. So, I mean, it is astonishing. He, I think he discovered how to play that sort of music, or certainly discovered a new way to play that sort of music.
Yeah, it is.
Because he was compensating for the obstacles of the piano.
That the piano presented, yeah. It's very interesting in that respect. Almost, I mean, that was a bit of a, what was his name? Cage did a bit of that, didn't he? Prepared piano, I think he called it. But that was like obviously more drastic. But can you bear with me just 1 minute? There's noise outside. I'm just going to pause the recording and just ask for silence in the corridors. Back on.
Okay.
There's always that sound from the kitchen that when washing up is being done in a particularly meaningful, sort of aggressive manner. I don't mind hearing washing up, but I don't like hearing washing up being done in an accusatory manner. Yes. So Jarrett, you're right.
It wasn't just Cage though. So Brian Eno famously used to mess with the musicians he worked with. Most famously of all, the group that were recording David Bowie's albums in Berlin. So Lodger, Low, and Heroes.
Right.
And just part of the way that he functioned was to pull out these random cards and to get them to do stupid things, which, by the way, they all hated. And they despised him at the time, and they despised what he was trying to do. And then everybody afterwards grudgingly acknowledged that maybe the albums are, in fact, amazing. Yes.
Robert Fripp was in that band, wasn't he? From King Crimson. I think he played the guitar on Heroes. I don't know if he was a regular member. It might have been a...
He did indeed play the guitar on Heroes, but when he came in, he was massively jet lagged. He had no idea what was happening. He was just asked to, he hadn't heard the song, he was just asked to improvise some stuff. And one of the things that distracted him was that Carlos Alomar was playing the drums. Now, Carlos Alomar is one of the world's greatest guitar players, but Eno had pulled out this card that said everyone swap instruments. So Alomar's sitting there on the drums while Fripp is improvising. And I mean, none of this makes any sense at all, and yet the end result is Heroes.
That's interesting. Gosh, putting a guitarist on the drums, that's that could really cause kind of human resources issues, couldn't it, if it went wrong?
I don't know. Is it worse to put the drummer on the guitar? I really don't know. As you can probably
you'll know that the greatest cliche, in music, is that Ringo wasn't even the best drummer in the Beatles. Which Lennon never said, in fact, and he is held in high esteem by significant drummers. Phil Collins thinks he was tremendous, and that's good enough for me. But there were reports that McCartney would occasionally do his own drumming in various recording studios, I think, and I can't imagine it went down particularly well. It does seem to be a little bit disrespectful somehow, but I mean, it just wouldn't happen the other way around, would it? I suppose that's basically what I'm saying. You couldn't conceivably ask the drummer to play the guitar, but there is this sort of sense that anyone can do the drums.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think what was interesting was just the very fact, like, why would you ask Keith Jarrett to play a broken piano?
Yeah.
But the idea is, well, if you don't really know what you're doing, you're going to find a way to do something interesting, and who knows? And of course, you can remix the whole thing afterwards. You can throw away all the junk. I'm sure all kinds of crap was produced in these recording sessions. But I mean, actually, there's a very interesting video on YouTube of Tony Visconti, who often gets overshadowed by Eno, but Visconti was the one who was actually producing this stuff.
Yeah.
An amazing clip of Visconti playing the 3 different takes of Fripp on the guitar, that amazing guitar intro to Heroes.
Yeah.
And none of them sound anything like the final thing. And then when he mixes all 3 of them together, and you realize that actually part of the genius here is what Visconti got out of the raw material.
Yeah, that is it's an easily misunderstood and overlooked aspect of creating great records, isn't it? I think, funny enough, I went to see a talk given by Brian Eno at the Sadler's Wells Theatre. This was probably in the 1990s, I think. And he was talking about popular culture. He was talking about pop music versus classical music, and misplaced snobbery with regard to both of those. And then also just generally, it was quite interesting. He was a bit ahead of the curve, I think. He was talking about, it was before social media existed, and I think before Big Brother existed, but he was talking about the degree to which people's lives were becoming performative, I guess. And within that regard, specifically, he was talking about Bowie's wedding. He'd been to Bowie. David Bowie had married Iman, I think her name is, isn't it, the model? And it had, of course, been a star-studded affair. There is a very famous photograph, you've probably seen it, in which Eno himself is there at the wedding, along with Yoko Ono and Bono. And they're all standing in a row, Eno, Ono, Bono. When you first look at the picture, you just think, oh, they're just 3 famous people, without realizing they've been turned into a sort of human nursery rhyme. But
I mean, Eno is a really interesting guy. He's a nerd like me, so that's why I like him. But he actually, I'm going to pull. I wasn't planning to do this, but just across the room was Messy,
right.
My book of a few years ago, which begins with the Cone concert.
Right.
And I interviewed Eno for the book, and he's just a very interesting. He thinks hard about all of this stuff. And later, I got a text from him. There's nothing to do with the book, and the text was, Tim, if you were transported back in time to the 8th century, what would you take with you to make yourself useful to the locals, but that wouldn't get you immediately burnt as a witch? I just thought, that's a very specific and also rather brilliant question. I don't know what your answer would be, Simon. But,
8th century, I mean, that's quite primitive. That's the Dark Ages, isn't it? I suppose a cigarette lighter, a decent quality refill. No, you're not going to get petrol, are you? So it'll only last as long as the gas or whatever that you've got in it. But they would understand the principle of a sparking flint, and being able to start fires quickly would be quite handy. I don't think you could take anything. I mean, anything that functioned with electronics would be of no use whatsoever, would it? So most things would be, maybe a Swiss Army knife.
Swiss Army knife would be, that would be cool.
You could kind of go, this has been blacksmith, but really high quality smithery, but that's about all, His thing, though, what I remember when he gave that talk. Sorry, go on. Yeah.
No, I was going to say my answer was actually was inspired by something in the 50 Things That Made the Modern Economy. Was the Langstroth beehive, which was invented in about 1850 by a priest called Lorenzo Langstroth.
Yeah.
And the distinctive thing about the Langstroth beehive is that you can lower these frames into the box of the hive, and they're exactly the right space that the bees don't gum them up, and they also don't fill them with their own honeycombs. So they will build the honeycombs on these frames, and then you can remove the honeycombs and you can scrape off the honey, and you can, without killing the bees. The medieval hives, like the Winnie the Pooh hives that look like kind of wicker baskets, you have to kill all the bees in order to get the honey, which is a problem. So I thought the Langstroth beehive, because that's you could replicate that technology, you could explain how it worked, and it would be self-evidently useful.
Yes, exactly. They would see the purpose of that, wouldn't they? And you would probably be allowed to live in a monastery, which is about as good as you could hope for in the 8th century after that.
I think so.
Yeah, as long as you're inside the monastery. His point, I just wanted to go back, that talk that he gave at the Sadler's Wells thing, and it was the first time anyone had talked about the degree to which everything was being done for OK Magazine and Hello Magazine, whichever one had been given the rights to it. And nothing really happened in its own natural way. Everything was a photo opportunity the entire day. And I remember listening to him and thinking, that's quite interesting, that he has that kind of insight into how celebrity culture and photography culture and signing off the rights to media and so on has infiltrated this most intimate of days. And then a few years later, I got married. I think it was 2003. And it was exactly like that. We had no magazine deal. We had no publication deal. Nobody was interested in seeing afterwards. But everything is entirely stage managed. All weddings are like that. That's not just David Bowie's wedding. That just is what weddings are like. From the moment you wake up in the morning, with the exception possibly of one beer or a couple that you have in the pub before you actually attend, as soon as the event starts, everything is being watched. Everything is performative. There's the first dance, the speeches, the church part, and the getting changed and then getting in the car and being waved off down the road and all that. And it did make me wonder whether Eno had ever been to a normal wedding or whether he thought that was just what David Bowie's weddings were like. But what he said was, which I did think was spot on, and I thought about this on multiple occasions since, is that a lot of classical music buffs look down their noses rather at pop music because it tends to be a very predictable chord sequence, the first, the fourth, the fifth. It tends to go through very sort of simple arpeggios, and the melodies are very easily hummed, and the harmonies are not very complex. And you listen to string quartets or a symphony or whatever, and you realize there's an awful lot more going on. But Eno's point was that those aren't the variations on which fans of pop music judge it. They know it's all the same tunes. That's why they like it. That's why you can enjoy it after only the second or third hearing. But what's new is that suddenly this one has the sound of a car crash in it, or this one has the sound of like a frog burping, or this one has a sort of weird electronic drum sound that you've never heard, and this one has squealing guitar that sounds like a baby crying, or like a juggernaut. It's always the sound structures that you get in pop music, a vastly greater range than you will sound, which is true. I mean, when my son will say, whenever we listen to Radio 3 in the car, he cannot distinguish one thing from the next. It literally all sounds the same to him because the variations he's looking for just don't exist. It's all a load of violins.
Yeah, it makes you realize how much of what we listen to is you're practicing observing certain distinctions, and there are other distinctions that are just completely lost on you. And that's probably true for much more than music.
I think it is. I think when people go, oh, all X is the same, what they're missing is the quality by which the fans judge it, the things that go on that, and if you don't like a certain thing, I mean, I've never really got Ska, to be honest. It's okay, I'll have a dance at a party, but I wouldn't buy an album of Ska because I'm probably just hearing, there's probably some aspect of it that changes quite a bit, but I don't hear that change. I just hear that offbeat kind of bat, 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 and I kind of go, oh, it's one of those things again, and it's gone, I don't know. Yeah. I think there's he's a good pop analyst, and he's obviously made his living out of. He knew he was an outsider. I remember when he left Roxy Music.
Roxy Music.
Yeah, and there were famously two Brians, and neither of them could either sing or play music. Brian Eno was a fantastic vocalist, but nobody would call him a singer, really. Certainly not on the first couple of albums. He probably improved a little bit over time. He could sort of float notes up there, couldn't he? And Brian Eno would sort of stand by the keyboard on top of the pops and look as if he was making a musical contribution as well. They were a fantastic couple.
Well, I mean, so much of it was conceptual.
Yeah.
And he still does visual art, for example. So,
It's wonderful. So your new
I visited his studios. There was loads of interesting stuff going on there.
Your new podcast of Cautionary Tales. What are the tales you're looking at this time around?
So we're doing a pandemic mini-series, which sounds, I'm sure, very appealing. But the idea is to look at particular incidents in the past and then use them to shed light on what's happening now. So the one that was released this week was called The Spreadsheet of Life and Death. And it's about quite a remarkable man, Clive Stone, who was dying of cancer and couldn't get the NHS to pay for the drug, and managed to persuade his local MP, who was a man called David Cameron, to take up this this crusade almost, and promised during the election campaign of 2010 that he was going to do something about this. And it's all about how you make decisions as to what's worth spending money on to try to save lives. And the inevitable problems you immediately get tangled up in when you put a dollar value on a life. But also the terrible problems you get tangled up in when you don't put a dollar value on a life. So it clearly ties in with the whole decision as to when to go into lockdown and all of this.
It's interesting that, isn't it? People have had to confront, I suppose most people are aware that sort of decision does take place somewhere and they don't want to see it. It's the old sort of sausages and laws thing. You don't want to know how budgets are divided up. But everyone has had to confront that a lot more bluntly than would be normal for the population at large, I suppose, in terms of, what lives... We never got anywhere close to the sort of battlefield triage scenarios that we were hearing about from northern Italy. But I suppose...
not yet.
No,
not yet.
Well, you never know. It might come back. But working out what the real impacts are likely to be of economic decline, I presume that's somebody's job as well, or are people just sort of taking a view on that? I assume somebody crunches those numbers.
Well, people are thinking about it, but it happens so fast and it's so unprecedented that so much of this is being made up as we go along. So one of the other cautionary tales is about what happened after the Japanese tsunami caused this nuclear incident at Fukushima.
Yeah.
And the evacuation away from Fukushima, just scrambling to get these people away from this nuclear power station, and the terrible impact it had on the lives of all the people who were evacuated, and the suicides and the depression. It's really a very sad story.
That is interesting.
It's all about trying to sort of make that decision and try to save people's lives. And in the end, actually, on reflection, they said we didn't save anyone's life. The radiation probably was never that bad, but
no,
I had
that's
to make
right.
that decision.
And it costs lives. That I didn't know that, because I've heard it's often brought up that when certainly people who are in favour of switching to nuclear energy on a massive scale as being the silver bullet environmentally for safe energy, fossil fuels could be replaced by nuclear in a way that that's probably the simplest and most tested technology. And then the argument against is always about the safety issue, and they say even Fukushima, I think it was one life was lost as a direct consequence or something like that of the actual meltdown.
Yeah, I'm not sure how many.
Tiny number anyway.
Was.
Yeah,
but it was one of these situations where, just as with the lockdown, you're faced with this awful threat. You don't know how bad the threat is. You don't have time to really make an informed decision. You just got to decide: are we going to do this thing to deal with the threat? And then later you have to figure out, well, what was all the collateral damage? And it's just inevitable that mistakes are going to be made in these circumstances.
Now, I suppose the obvious question there then is, we are now easing off on lockdown, but there are still fears that there may be a second wave, possibly just as a natural consequence of the nature of the thing, and also possibly as a consequence of a sort of over exuberant public released out into the hot weather and gathering in extraordinary numbers on beaches and so on. Would we now be expected to have looked around the world at the various approaches taken by other regimes, governments and so on, and picked the best one, or the one that seems to be most appropriate to our situation? Or are governments just not up to taking that kind of rational approach, and will they carry on and sort of go, no, we know what we're doing?
Well, I wrote a piece about this for the Financial Times, and my sense is we're not learning as much from each other as we should. And I think that's partly just the general narrow-mindedness and xenophobia of any country, but particularly the British. The fact that we don't speak anyone else's language, I think it sounds so pathetic, but it really makes a difference.
Yeah.
But another reason is simply that most of the time, the kind of lessons you might learn don't really carry over. So we don't have much to learn about the way the Japanese regulate their banks, for example, because everything's so different. You could sort of, there was a delegation came from Vietnam to figure out how to set up a pension scheme in Vietnam, and they were looking at the pension system in the UK. In the end, the conclusion is, well, there's nothing really to be learned because everything's so different.
Yeah.
Here, the virus is kind of the same everywhere.
Yeah.
We're all going through the same thing, but we're just not set up to learn these lessons, which is a big problem.
It does seem to be, doesn't it? I think it's caused a huge amount of irritation and impatience, really, because the trouble is we do have the international media now that makes people aware of the other outcomes that other countries have enjoyed. It might have been easier when there was you just had to accept that your reality was the reality, but we can all see other countries and having much better outcomes. And the first few times you think, well, Japan, Singapore, China, those are obviously very different in important regards, respects. Singapore, for better or for worse, has a certain authoritarian style of government that does enable it to take, this kind of swift and decisive action. But we're running out of kind of cushioning on the underside at the moment, aren't we, in Britain?
No, we really are. There were all these stories about how things are really bad in Italy because all the Italians kiss a lot and they've got this very, they stand very close, and the same thing with Spain. And in the end, it turned out, no, we managed to have a worse outbreak than much anywhere. It depends exactly how you measure it, but we've not done well. I mean, it's a national tragedy. And we're really going to have to pick apart all of the different things that went wrong. Some of it, I'm sure, bad luck, but I think a lot of we made a lot of wrong calls, I'm afraid.
So this is the meat of your new podcast, anyway. Tim, where can people find that? Is it on the BBC?
So no, it is not on the BBC.
Is it not? Okay, independent.
It's an independent podcast. It's produced by an American company called Pushkin. Co-produced by the mighty Malcolm Gladwell himself.
Wow!
But if you look for cautionary tales, or if you go to my website timharford.com, you will find it.
That's fantastic. Well, I hope all our many excitable viewers will do so. And of course, as we discovered last time, one or two will purchase your books as well, including Messy, which you held up there. 50 Things That Changed the World. 50 Economic Things That Changed the World. Is that
50, whatever. 50 Shades of Grey. It's like 50 things that made the modern economy, and the
modern
next
economy.
50 things that made the modern economy. Yes.
And that's the latest one as well. But anything
if you want to buy 50 Shades of Grey, that's fine too.
Various undercover economists with various shades of grey. Fantastic talking to you as always, Tim. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Simon. Great to
and
talk.
Hopefully see you in a licensed premises very soon.
I look forward to the day.
Cheers, mate. Take care.